Welcome back! In our last lesson, we created our final base form component for this course, the base radio. However, we left off with a component that is completely flexible and reusable, but sometimes a little hard to comprehend. For someone that is not familiar with the inner workings of a base radio, a group of them all pointing to the same B-model state can be confusing. Errors may also occur if someone forgets to add a name attribute to a certain part of a group. It would be better if we had a wrapping component that handled all the logic of managing the B-model connectors for our users, so that they only have to remember to do it once, as they do with most other components. And it's also easier to understand at a glance. Enter the BaseRadioGroup. As we mentioned in the last lesson, it doesn't really make sense when radio buttons are by themselves, as they don't really provide the user with choice, which is a key feature of radio buttons. So you almost always want to provide at least 2 radios per each group, unless you're doing something like this. Having said that, since we always want to have our base radio elements grouped, it makes sense to create a component that contains the logic for the grouping, the BaseRadioGroup. Let's dive right in. Let's start by going into our components folder and creating a new file, BaseRadioGroup.view, which will house our new component. This time, we won't copy-paste code from the demo form, since we will need to do a little bit more custom work. In order to get started, we need to create a prop that will allow the user of this component to pass an array of options that they want to let the user choose from. We also want to make sure that we use the data inside of this new options prop to loop through the containing objects and create a new base radio component instance for each one. The option property will be an array of objects, and we will want each of the objects inside to hold at least 2 properties, the label and the value. In this example, you can see that the label good boy is being applied to the label of the radio element. The value is what we will bind to on the B model. Let's add another object to our example. As you can see, when the user selects a new radio from the group, the V model binding to selected pet will correctly change to the value of the second option. Let's go ahead and add our props object. Inside, we will add the options prop. Its type will be of array, and it will be required. It is important to remember to set the options property as required, since this component simply won't work without it. Let's go ahead and now add to our template the base radio loop. We will add a before declaration option in options. We will then set the key to the option value. We will set the label to the option label, and we will then set the value to the option value. As we learned in the last lesson, all radio groups are bound together as a group by the name property. All of the radios in a group need to have the same name so that the browser knows that they ought to be grouped together. So, let's go ahead and add our second prop, the name prop, and make sure it's correctly bound into our base radio components. Let's go ahead and add the name property into our props object. It will be of type string and required. Then we will bind the name property of our base radio loop to our name prop. Now that we are correctly looping through our radio components, you probably know what's coming next. It is time to allow for this component to handle B-model two-way binding. Like always, we'll add the model value prop first. Let's scroll down and add the model value prop. Its type will be of string and number. This time around, we're going to make the prop required, since radio groups without anything selected don't make much sense. There's not really a nothing selected state when using this type of form input. Let's now scroll up and bind the model value prop to each base radio element in the loop. Next, let's start listening to the update model value event of each of the base radio elements and emit it right back to the parent of the base radio group. We can now save the file, go back to simpleform.view, and replace the Are Pets Allowed section Base Radio Elements with a brand new BaseRadioGroup. We will set the vModel to event.pets, the name property to pets, and the options property to a pet options array that we will create in a minute. We can also get rid of this extra code now. Let's now scroll down all the way into our data and add the pet options array. We will add two objects to the array. The first one will be a label of yes and a value of 1. The second one will be a label of no and a value of 0. We can now go into the browser and bask in the glory of our not very nice looking group of radios. It looks like we're going to have to do some extra work to make it space correctly, but at least it's working. Before we replaced our base radio components in simple form view, they were each wrapped in a div. Because of the block nature of div tags, it separated them each in their own line. Our base radio component is agnostic to presentation. It's only an input and label tag in the end. It is our job as the users to determine how they must be presented in the screen. For our base radio group, I would like to create the possibility of the radios being aligned both horizontally and vertically. To keep it as simple as possible, all of this switching will be controlled by one single new prop, vertical. We will default the layout of the radios in our base radio group to horizontal, so this prop will be of type Boolean and default to false. It is a very common practice when creating components to set props that are meant to toggle on and off, also known as flags, to a default of false. That allows us to be able to set them to on with a very clear syntax on the instance of the component. For example, with our vertical prop, if the user wants to have their group laid out vertically, they would simply add the keyword to the instance, like in the example. Boolean props in view that are not specifically bound are assumed to be true. So in the above example, vertical is the same as vertical equal true. Let's go back to BaseRadioGroup.view and add our vertical prop and begin setting up for this new functionality. Scroll all the way down and add the vertical property. The type will be a Boolean, and the default will be false. Now, in order to use our vertical prop, we have to wrap our radio group loop in a component of its own. When the radios are horizontal, we want it to be a span, and when they are vertical, we will use a div. There are, of course, many ways to solve this particular problem, but this solution in particular allows me to show you how to leverage the power of component is for your dynamic form components. Let's scroll all the way to the beginning of the file again. We will begin by wrapping everything up in a component element and moving the before loop onto it. We will also bring the key property binding. Finally, don't forget to add the wrapping tag. Now we have to determine the logic for the is property of the component. Whatever string we pass into there will be what Vue uses when rendering the component. So if we set the is property to div, the wrapper component will be a div. And if we set it to span, it will of course be a span. Since this is not very complex logic, we can get away with leaving it all in the template. We will check if the vertical prop is true, and if so, it will be a div, and if not, it will be a span. Please notice that both the div and span are wrapped in single quotes since they must be strings. If we now go back to our simple form and set the vertical flag for our base radio group and check in the browser, everything seems to work as expected. Let's now go back to simpleform.view. There is one more adjustment we need to make for the horizontal layout. The elements are sort of touching each other, so we need to add a bit of styling in order to separate them. First, we will remove the vertical flag, and we will go back to BaseRadioGroup. Scroll all the way down and add a style block. We will add a horizontal CSS class and set the margin right to 20 pixels. Now we can scroll all the way up and add a class binding. In this class binding, we are using the object syntax to toggle the classes on and off. Whenever the condition not vertical evaluates to true, so whenever vertical is false, we will want to apply our horizontal CSS class. Let's go back to the browser and check it out. Our horizontal layout not only now works, but also looks really good. In the next lesson, we will take a small turn and look at how we can handle form submitting correctly in Vue by leveraging the power of a widely used library for making HTTP requests, Axios. See you there!